Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very first lecture in government. Um, in the first chapter here, we're going to kind of look at the basics of government as a whole, and kind of get into all the characteristics and stuff that kind of make up how government operates. And then as we move forward through the course, we'll next take a look at the constitutions, specifically the U.S. Constitution, look at the federalism system, um, that is used here in the United States as a government structure, and then we're going to look at, to finish the year, really each of the three branches um, that make up our government. And if we have any time at the end, we'll look at some specifics in terms of more of the state governments as well. So let's get started here with the principles of government. All right, so the first thing that you need to understand is you need to understand the actual territory that we're dealing with and the government structure that goes along with it. So you have states, nations, and then you have nation states. Three terms, very similar, and they all connect together to form what we know today as countries. All right, so a state is a political community that has the two characteristics that you see on screen. They occupy a definite territory, and they have an organized system of government that makes and enforces laws with a higher form of approval. So, for example, Iceland here, or Spain, they have a defined territory, they have an organized government, they have laws that are enforced, and there's a higher form of approval within those countries. Okay. Two is your nation. Okay. It's a group of people united by a common bond. Or bonds. And traditionally, you look at those five traits: race, language, custom, tradition, and religion. Now, nations can actually stretch across many states. I like to kind of give this example here in the United States. You have various groups of Native Americans, like the Cherokee or the Seminole, Ojibwa, whatever. What is left of those nations or those races, they stretch across many states, and they're a group of people united by a common bond. You can look at it in terms of a nation as people that are Caucasian or African, or you can look at it in terms of Russian. You can look at it in terms of certain traditions they follow. If you want to look at a nation of just in terms of religion, like Christian or Hindu or whoever, that those ideas can span across many different lines and so forth. And then a nation state is when you take a country in which it has a territory of both the nation and state coinciding. So basically, you would have these two concepts, and then have any number of these. It could be one of them, it could be all of them, mixture of them, and that's a nation state. This is what you typically consider a nation state is what we could typically consider an actual country today. Like the United States is a nation state. We have definite territory, we have an organized government with laws and higher approval, and then we have a combination of all of these as well. All right, so we're going to get into the four features of a state. You have two here on screen, and we'll move on to the next two. So the first feature of a state is you have to have population. You have to have people. If you don't have a population, then the state doesn't exist. Now, there's two key things to understand with population. The nature of your population is affected, can affect stability. So what does that mean? It means that a government has to share its basic beliefs with people to be more stable. If you have like a population, let's say, is very democratic, and then you have a government that's very totalitarian, that government and that state itself might not be as stable because you have a full population that's really pushing back against it. Generally, if you have a government that is more democratic, and a people that are more democratic, or let's say both are communist or whatever, typically that government or that state is going to be much more stable. Also, mobility, mainly population shifts, can play a role in terms of affecting the state. And I want you to think about it in terms of the question that's posted on the screen. How does this affect politics? How does mobility or population shifts change politics? Okay, think about that for a second. All right. So the one example I like to give is when we look at the Electoral College. We have an election coming up here in a couple of months. Um, and if you have, we know that you guys should know that California is mainly a Democratic state. Wyoming is usually a Republican state. And California has like 58, high 50s electoral votes. I can't remember off the top of my head. Wyoming has 3. All right. Well, if a bunch of people in Wyoming that are all Republican, okay, move to California and then they register to vote, it's not really going to affect the election, right? It's not going to change in terms of anything in terms of the electoral votes. But let's say you just have a small number of people because there's a huge population in California. Let's say they're all Democratic. They vote Democrat, and they move to Wyoming. Okay, well, because Wyoming is a much smaller state, you have a lot more people coming in from California. In this example, that would actually change the election. Not hugely because it's only 3 electoral votes, but you can understand what I'm trying to say. Second thing here for states in terms of their features is territory. You need established boundaries. Okay, and I want you to think of these 2 questions that are on screen below it. Do boundaries cause conflict? Which, I mean, that's an obvious answer there. And then how do they change? So how do boundaries change both peacefully and non-peacefully that can establish territory and give greater power or make certain states weaker? All right, the final 2 features of a state that you need to understand are sovereignty and government. Now I'm going to do government first here, and we'll talk about sovereignty last because sovereignty is a much bigger concept and one that's a little bit harder for people to remember, or they're not as used to the actual term. So basically, guys, that's the definition of a government: institution that maintains social order, provides public services, and enforces binding decisions for the state. Okay, we pretty much understand what a government is and what it's supposed to do. Okay, in its basic form. Now, sovereignty is the principle that you have supreme and absolute authority within your territorial boundaries. It means that you have independence, power to make laws, the ability to shape your own foreign policy, if need be, depending on what we're talking about here in terms of sovereignty. If we're talking about like a state like Michigan or a country like the United States, you have the ability to determine your own course of action. Okay, and it all ties in with the final 2 bullet points here. Under this idea of sovereignty, the theory goes is that no state has a right to interfere with another's internal affairs. Because if you're a sovereign nation, you have the ability to make your own decisions. Okay, but does this happen? Do other states interfere with others' internal affairs? Of course they do, whether it's from a peaceful standpoint or something that's more of a violent nature like a war, like Germany invading Poland in 1939, or for example, in states here in the United States issuing trade deals or compacts between states. Okay, that can affect sovereignty in a positive way or a negative way. Generally, generally a positive way in terms of the compact example that I'm giving you. Now, also the principle here under sovereignty is that every state is legally equal. Okay, but I want you to take a second and think about that last bullet point there. Is this true? And I want you to look at the political cartoon that's on the screen that's showing Iraq is the door. You have the American flag holding the sovereignty key. What do you think this means? Okay, and is every state equal? No. We have countries that are very strong to some that are very weak, to many that are very weak. And then that can actually dictate whether or not sovereignty actually is truly equal, because you're going to see on the global scale, the United States is going to be able to dictate foreign policy a lot better than, let's say, the country of Lesotho in Southern Africa. So there's a huge difference there. All right, we have a couple 4 state origin theories we're going to go through here. These are all pretty simple. The first one is evolutionary theory. This is the most basic form of state origin. It's the easiest one to form. It's evolved from the family unit. Generally, the head of the family is the head of the government system. Okay, and I have, can you name any examples? Pretty much just think about your early hunter-gathering societies in history. Okay, this evolutionary theory isn't necessarily really around too much anymore in many places. Second one is force theory. It's when you have people are put in the authority of one person or group, and the leaders use actions and the military or police to actually protect, it says the city there. In this case, it can be the entire state. Okay? So kind of think in terms of like North Korea uses what we would call force theory. Okay? They use force to actually maintain their authority. All right. Last two theories here. We have the divine right theory. If you look here, this is King Louis the 16th, or sorry, Louis the 14th. My bad. Louis the 14th is kind of the perfect example of the king that fits within this idea of the divine right theory in terms of 1600s Europe. If you guys remember back to the Enlightenment and Scientific Revolution unit that we talked about in terms of history in world history class. But the idea of divine right theory is that a god or gods have chosen certain people to rule. Okay, depending on which culture you're looking at, if they're monotheistic or polytheistic, okay, you're looking at that chosen family to rule. Like in the case of the Egyptians, the Chinese, 16th century France, and 17th century France, and so forth. So it's the idea that they've been chosen to rule by God. And how do they really show this? Well, they show it through power in pretty much any means. In the example of the Egyptians, think about it. You had the pharaohs build their own pyramids. You have, in the case of Louis XIV here, he built the beautiful Palace of Versailles and so forth. So that's the idea of the divine right theory. And then the last one is the social contract. The social contract theory is pretty much what most of the world goes by today. It's that people enter into a contract to surrender certain powers to the state for protection. And how the social contract theory began was during the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment period, where philosophers and educators, okay, thinkers, started to question the rule of the kings of Europe in particular. And they started to question the idea of divine right rulership. And in particular, the two men here you see on screen at the bottom, Thomas Hobbes here on the right and John Locke on the left, they are the two that really define and developed the social contract theory. Thomas Hobbes actually agreed that society needs government, and because people need protection and stability, because they're ultimately, if they don't have that, they don't give up certain things, it will fall apart. And then John Locke advanced off those principles and said people deserve the right to life, liberty, and property. Okay, and if that sounds familiar to you, Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence and wrote life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, he took those words right out of John Locke's mouth. It's just they ended up changing property. He changed property to pursuit of happiness because of the issue of slavery in the United States. And I want to say one thing here, and I'm not trying to divulge this into a big argument, but what we're seeing here in the United States right now in particular, with certain groups of people protesting certain actions by really most of the governors across the United States because of the coronavirus, they're protesting saying their rights are being taken away. Well, they're not. It's just, it's because governments can do certain things at certain times, and we'll get into the emergency powers and stuff later in this course, but it all fits under this idea of social contract. You give up certain powers at certain times, and it can be a very fluid situation for the betterment of the people and the protection of the people. And that's been a kind of a big question going on right now. All right, we just have 3 slides here left. Pretty straightforward here. There are 4 purposes of government. First one is the government is supposed to maintain social order. It's that social contract. People need government for order or conflicts persist. Kind of links with what I was just trying to say. You have to provide some form of conflict resolution, allowing for laws to be made and to be enforced. Okay, such as people paying taxes, serving and being able to serve in the military, police, number of things. Okay, but there's limits on individuals, and this leads to law and order, which leads to civilized life. And again, this isn't as straight up as, oh, well, you're completely free. Okay, there is freedom, there's democracy and so forth. It's that you have what's determined, there's being determinants to actually provide that and maintain that social order, and it can change. Okay. Number 2, providing of public services. Governments have to provide community essentials. Okay, and generally what this does is it promotes the general welfare. People are much happier. They're going to follow along and do what they need to do. And examples here are public works projects to actually help the general public, such as building of parks, okay, maintaining of roads, the enforcement of health and safety laws, such as using government inspectors to go into restaurants and see, are they cooking the food properly? Are they storing it properly? Or just any nutritional label you see on any food or drink that you buy from the store. Things like that. Okay, the last 2 purposes of government here are they have to provide for national security. Now this is pretty straightforward. They have to do this in terms of protecting both from external and internal threats that can be really come from anywhere. Kind of think of terrorism, but also think in terms of actual general warfare. That question there, is this complex today, or this is complex today, and why? You guys should know that answer. Think about the global world we live in. Think about how everything is changing, even more so with this current pandemic, starting with COVID and so forth. There are certain issues, and it can be very complex for somebody to deal with, whether it's a president, whether it's a governor, local officials, whoever we're talking about here. They also have to make economic decisions. Okay, and the note here is no country can provide its citizens with everything they desire. Why? Well, it's the basic economic principle. Okay, there's shortages. Okay, there's supply and demand because of shortages. If you could provide everybody with everything they desire, everybody would be rich, everybody would be perfectly happy, we'd have no issues across the world. Okay, and you just can't do that. It's impossible to do so. So what issues can arise over the economy? Well, we're seeing some of those now. Unemployment benefits, lack of jobs or surplus of jobs. Okay, issues here can be positive or negative. And the economic decisions that countries make or governments make can be as simple as just issuing currency to controlling pretty much every economic decision, depending on the type of government, type of economic system they have. And I apologize for the cutoff here at the bottom, but it says governments try to stimulate economic growth and stability through controlling inflation, encouraging trade, and it says what's cut off is regulating natural resources. So governments, one of the biggest examples here of this stimulation of economic growth is what you see is when like a president comes in and they issue a tax cut. Okay, that's usually those tax cuts are used to help stimulate the economy. Okay, last slide here is government. This is actually not on your notes, but this is actually an important slide here just to kind of remember, keep in mind moving forward. This is why I have it. Is decisions made by the government are authoritative, which means they're forced upon all of society, or should be. Government authority comes from 2 things, and you have to remember this moving forward. 1, their legitimacy. That connects back to what we were talking about earlier, where governments work better when the people and the governments have pretty much the same ideals. It's the willingness of the citizens to obey the government. And a lot of the protests we're seeing here, whether they're for Black Lives Matter, whether it's for people not having, jobs being closed down or, being in quarantine, these are actions that can be pushed back upon, or people push back against the government. Some in good ways, some in bad ways. And then 2, their ability to use coercive force. And it's the government's ability to use force when necessary, and not necessary in some cases, because governments aren't perfect. They will use force when they don't necessarily have to, from the police, from the military, or even from the judicial system, to force people to pay things like taxes or install a punishment system or so forth. Okay, so these 2 ideas you have to remember in terms of where does the government authority come from. 1, it comes mainly from the legitimacy. 2, it comes from really their ability to use coercive force. Okay, all right, guys, that's all I got for you. I'll see you guys in section 2, and we'll do some more in terms of the basic principles of government. See ya.